Hello, welcome to Guitar Gaze Learning Course Lesson 3. My name is Eric Wright, creator of Guitar Gaze and author of a numerical and visuospatial method for learning guitar. And today we're going to get into the advantages of that numerical and visuospatial relationship by looking at scales similarities, and starting to form the foundation of what will allow you to more quickly memorize lots of different scales and prepare you to improvise without getting lost on the fretboard. So today we're going to go through lesson 1 and 2 review. There are some critical things that you need to know from the previous lessons that if you don't, you're going to be lost. We're going to look at the interval classes that define different scales. We're going to look at similarities between scales. And we're going to look at the pentatonic neutral scale and the Dorian mode in practice, since those are the best starting point for scale memorization, and we will show why later. So real quick, if this is your first time watching a video from this channel, there are a few important things that you missed in lessons 1 and 2 that you need to know for any of this to make sense. Important thing number 1, standard tuning disrupts the continuity and consistency of notes across the fretboard of the guitar, because in standard tuning, instead of the intervals between all of the strings being equivalent to 5 frets or half steps, like you see here with the A string being equivalent to the 5th fret on the E string, there's an inconsistency between the G and the B string, where the interval between those two strings is only 4 half steps. This is unlike other string instruments such as violin, cello, bass guitar, which are tuned isomorphically, just means the intervals between all the strings are the same. So important thing number 2, if we make a slight adjustment to make all of those intervals the same by adjusting the B and the E string just 1 half step to C and F, then the intervals between all of the strings are equivalent to 5 half steps. And this makes the guitar isomorphic. So I will interchangeably refer to this tuning configuration as CF tuning or isomorphic tuning or all-fourths tuning, and it just means that the intervals between all the strings are equivalent to 5 half steps, and the natural repeating geometric pattern, or translation tessellation as it's called in geometry, is restored on the guitar, and everything is consistent across the fretboard, and the patterns repeat themselves horizontally and vertically rather than just horizontally. So that repeating geometric pattern that I just mentioned, which you can see pretty clearly in the image here, is super important thing number 3. So in CF isomorphic all-fourths tuning, the notes on the guitar repeat themselves in the same way everywhere on the fretboard. No matter where you're at on the fretboard, if you are at the root note, which is 0, you've got the same notes immediately around it as you do anywhere else that note is located. So in isomorphic all-fourths tuning, the notes on the guitar repeat themselves in the same way everywhere on the fretboard, which leads us to important thing number 4. With our new isomorphic tuning arrangement, we then represent notes with numbers using 0 as the root and either positive or negative values based on intervals or fret distance from the root. So you can see we've got, if 0 is our root, and we can assign any note 0, the root that we choose or the key that we're in will always have the root as 0. If you go up a fret, you're 1, up 2 frets from 0 is 2, 3, 4, so on, and below is -1, -2, -3, -4. We also add the color to it to make it just a little clearer to see things, and this allows us to inspect patterns on the guitar more intuitively and help commit things to memory using numbers and color rather than just alphabetical note assignments. So ultimately what this results in, and which was the focus of the previous lesson, lesson 2, numerical introduction, is a repeating numerical and geometric structure with built-in symmetries, namely the 3x3, so this 3x3 box of notes and the 4x4 box of notes here. Those two repeating shapes fuse together the guitar, and if you are familiar with the intervals within those shapes, you can never get lost across the guitar. You can keep track of where you're at using those intervals. So this is a translatable numerical framework that can be used to fast-track guitar learning by an order of magnitude, or One might even say a factor of 12, because then instead of having to learn everything up all 12 frets to memorize an entire scale, you can just memorize a much smaller pattern of notes and just relocate that same pattern over and over again, and you've got the scale memorized. So rather than have to learn everything across all 6 strings and all 12 frets, you can just memorize a much simpler standardized pattern that assigns zeros the root note and expresses everything numerically based on intervals relative to that root note. If you memorize a scale pattern, you can simply slide the pattern up or down horizontally on the guitar. Everybody knows this. If you memorize a scale pattern, you can slide it up somewhere else and play it in a different key. You cannot, however, simply shift that pattern vertically. I refer to going up the strings within an individual fret as vertical movement. You can't simply shift things vertically everywhere on the fretboard in standard tuning. And the reason is because of that inconsistency between the G and the B string. That is a different interval. But in CF isomorphic tuning, which, to clarify, the bottom 4 strings of the guitar are isomorphic. Bass guitar is isomorphic. As I said, violin is isomorphic. Even the B and the E string originally are isomorphic relative to the other strings. It's just the G and the B interval, G to the B interval, that is different. So in isomorphic tuning, just as there is that repeating pattern of 12 notes going up the neck that allows you to slide scale shapes up and down the neck, now you can slide them vertically. And this means you have much less to memorize, and you're much more free to navigate the guitar without getting lost. So in other words, all you have to do is familiarize yourself with this one standard repeating interval structure, and the world is your oyster on the guitar. Here you can see this geometric approach overlaid with the C major scale, kind of fades in and out, and this is the fretboard viewer at guitargaze.com. You can use that to visualize scales and visualize the intervals here, and you can do custom color assignments and whatever you want. These are the colors I chose, and this is just sort of like a time lapse showing the major scale and then bringing in that numerical geometric shape structure that underlies everything. So you can see that, if you're within that 4x4, 3x3 structure, if you're playing a different mode or a different scale, you simply fill in those structures differently. You could call that filling them in differently based on the mode or scale that you're playing in. Alternatively, you could also just imagine the same shape and relocate the root note within that rather than memorizing different shapes within a standard shape, but we'll get to that in later lessons. For now, in this lesson, ultimately our goal is to play around with the pentatonic neutral scale and the Dorian mode, because this is the best starting point for learning other scales as well, because these two scales, the pentatonic neutral scale and Dorian mode, are fully symmetrical. They're what I refer to as central to music, meaning they rely on common notes that are a bridge between genres and can be used as a foundation for easily learning other modes and scales. And you might think it sounds weird to say common notes and have favoritism towards one note over another, like aren't all notes just notes and shouldn't they all be equal? Well, when you think of things numerically and the root note is always 0, there are some notes that are more important or more commonly used across scales and genres and keys than other notes. First, before we get into scale similarities in the pentatonic neutral and scale and Dorian mode and practice them, we're going to look at just some brief similarities between major scales and show that to learn 16 different modes and scales in 12 different keys rather than have to memorize 16 times 12 would be 192 different patterns across the entire fretboard, which would be a lot. We can instead standardize everything and get most of the way there with just one simple pattern. And this slide that you see here was shown in lesson 1. These are the major scales. This shows the alphabetical note assignments as they would appear in isomorphic tuning on the guitar. So, this vertical column, you can imagine if you're starting on E string, you go up to the A string, D, G, C, F, A sharp, D sharp, G sharp, C sharp, so on, so on. That's the repeating vertical column of notes, and each major scale can just be thought of as a vertical stack or column of 7 adjacent notes, and then depending on the major scale that you're in, you reposition that same shape of 7 adjacent notes. There's a lot to this, and that is a good starting point for looking at scale similarities today as we get into the numerical scale relationships and the core notes that comprise different scales. So to begin, we're done with the review. Now we're getting into the core of this lesson. We've got our 12 major scales. We have our note columns up here. So C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F. Each of these columns represents that note, and then each of these rows shows the major scale of those different keys and all the blue boxes that are highlighted. So all these blue boxes show what notes are in that major scale. So for C major, for example, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, of course. So that's why those are all highlighted. The 7 modes of the C major scale are the same as the major scale in other keys whose major scale contains C. Or to think of it another way for guitar, the 7 modes of C major are created by changing the position of C within the spatial structural pattern of the major scale, which the spatial structural pattern of the major scale is whole step, half step, whole step, half step. For example, in the Locrian mode, C is positioned 1/2 step lower relative to its original position in the major scale structure, which is the white box. So this is the C major, its original location in that whole, half, whole, half structure is this white box. Now, the Locrian mode, you instead shift that whole, half structure forward one so that C is 1 below its original location in that scale structure. And for Aeolian, it's 3 below its original location. Mixolydian, it's 5 below. Lydian, it's 5 above. Phrygian, it is 4 above. Dorian, 2 above. And then back to major. So that's what I mean when you say all these different modes are essentially just the major scale structure, but with the root note C in a different location within that structure. So you'll notice here that you've got whole, half, whole, half. And going from bottom to top, you also have whole, half, whole, half. So that's, how these modes and the structure of the major scale relate to one another. And that's important for a number of reasons, but for now, just understand that if we replace that exact same thing with numbers, we can see the same relationship that I just described slightly more clearly. So rather than using the alphabetical note assignments, let's apply our numerical note assignments based on the interval classes we adopted in lesson 2. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus or minus 6, minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, minus 5. You've got your root note 0 in your major key. So that's 0 major. Locrian, as I said, is that original starting point is 1 above where the root note now is. So that's 1 major, 2 major, Aeolian's 3 major, 4, 5, so on. That's the way that I named these here, since we have a numerical learning system instead of an alphabetical learning system. So again, to clarify from the last one, you can see, for example, in the 0 major scale, the root note is on the white square, indicating that unique position in the major scale structure. Locrian is 1 below, so minus 1. And we got Aeolian, it's 3 below, minus 3. Mixolydian, it's 5 below, minus 5. And those positions throughout here, 0, 2, 4, 5. So I'll slow down. 0, 2 above, 4 above, 5 above, 5 below, 3 below, 1 below. So 0, 2, 4, 5, minus 3, minus 1. those are the interval classes that define the major scale. And just as going, as I said, left to right, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, you can go bottom to top, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. This is the exact same thing as the previous one, just with the numerical note assignments instead. Now notice the order of these columns. It's just as it would be if you go up a string from, let's say, B is your root note, and you go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, if we change the order of those columns so that instead of going up from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's as if you're going up the strings. So you go from here to here, which is equivalent to 5 half steps. Remember, going up one string, staying within a single fret, is equivalent to going up 5 half steps. So you go from 0 to 5, and then from 5, you go another 5 half steps up to the next string, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is -2, to 3, to -4, to 1, and so on. That's how these are organized now. And when you sort things isomorphically based on the string intervals of the guitar like that, it bundles the notes that are in that mode or scale together and makes it much easier to compare them and see how they're different from one another. Because this checkerboard pattern back here can be a little dizzying. It all kind of looks the same. It's a little disorienting. This bundles things together and makes it clearer to assess scale relationships and similarities. So now we're gonna take out the major scales that aren't modes and just stick with the 7 modes. And we're going to organize or sort those 7 modes in ascending or descending order, depending on which way you look at it, from Lydian to Ionian or major, mixed Lydian, Dorian, all down to Locrian. So we've sort of got this staircase pattern here, and you can see the 7 modes very clearly and see how some are similar, some are not so similar. But the important thing is the 7 modes are crucial to learning music and learning scales because their specific modal sounds are relied on by various genres and styles of musical expression. And by viewing the 7 modes through this isomorphic numerical lens, we can easily see what they share in common with one another and what sets them apart from one another. And for example, the only difference between the major mode and the Lydian mode is instead of 5, you have plus or minus 6 in the Lydian mode. So major mode, instead of having 5, you go to Lydian and you see that you don't have that. Instead, that is plus or minus 6. That is the only difference between the Ionian and Lydian modes, or the major scale and the Lydian mode of the major scale. Similarly, the only difference between the major and the mixed Lydian is instead of -1, you have -2 in the mixed Lydian. So instead of -1, you got a -2 in the mixed Lydian. That is the only difference between those two. The Dorian mode is central to all these modes. You can see it's in the center of this diagram. And this is crucial. This is why we select the Dorian mode and the pentatonic neutral scale, which is this 5-note subset of the Dorian mode, as our starting points for scale memorization, because they are built off what is called common notes, or what I refer to as common notes when you're using this interval pitch class numerical note assignment. Those notes that those are comprised of using that music learning system are common notes that are used more frequently across scales and genres and modes and music in general. So the Dorian mode is central, meaning it shares more notes with other modes than any other mode. And we will emphasize this again momentarily. For now, just appreciate the fact that we've compressed the 7 different modes from 12 different keys into this little easy to digest diagram. And another thing worth noting that we will touch on in the next lesson is that the different modes can be thought of as blends of their adjacent modes and easily applied to the fretboard. And what I mean by blend of adjacent modes, for example, the Mixolydian mode on the fretboard, starting from the root note 0, for the first half of the Mixolydian scale is 2, 4, 5, which is identical to the major scale. So that the first half of Mixolydian is identical to major, which is the one above Mixolydian in this diagram. And then the second half of the Mixolydian scale, which is -5, -3, -2, is identical to the Dorian mode, or the mode below the Mixolydian mode in this diagram. So, in other words, if you know the Dorian and you know the major, you know the Mixolydian, because you just smash the two together, and the hybrid of the two is the Mixolydian scale. So that makes learning the Mixolydian easy if you know those two. Same thing applies down here. You know, these other scales can be thought of as just blends of the other modes around them in this diagram. So everything that we're learning here is going to be used to learn the next thing. And it's sort of analogous to a spider building a web. You know, it's really hard to put up those first foundational strands at first. You got to find a tree on one side of the trail and some twig or something super far away on the other, and it takes like half a day. But then once you get your foundations in place, every strand that you build on top of that as you circle around and around and around gets quicker and easier and much more straightforward. So finally, let's add into those 7 modes other common scales and place those other common scales under the modes they are most similar to. So if we sort the scales this way, we've got 16 different modes and scales on this diagram here. This makes them way quicker to learn. So, you know, if a scale is nearly identical to a mode that you've already learned, there isn't much left to learn. For example, if you know the Aeolian or the natural minor, you pretty much know the harmonic minor. The harmonic minor is the same as the Aeolian, except instead of -2, you got -1. Sound familiar? Sounds like the same exercise we just went through. Harmonic minor, basically identical to natural minor, just with that one note change. So using the numerical approach, you don't have to memorize those different shapes and the different alphabetical note assignments across 12 different keys. You've got the standard numerical approach. That's the one change you have to make, and it just translates wherever you're at on the guitar. So that's really useful. And then furthermore, if you know the harmonic minor scale, you can play the Spanish Gypsy scale in that key by simply shifting everything up a string, which you can see on this diagram here. So you got, you'll notice that this harmonic minor shape, you've got one outlier out here, and then you skip 2, and you got this bundle of 4, and then you skip 1, and you got this bundle of 2. If you go down to the Spanish Gypsy, you see the exact same thing, except everything's shifted to the right one. And on this diagram, remember, shifting to the right one is equivalent to shifting up 1 string. So the only difference between the harmonic minor and the Spanish Gypsy is that, you know, the shapes are shifted up a string. That's readily apparent on this diagram, and that would not be readily apparent if you were staring at alphabetical note assignments. So that's pretty cool in and of itself. You know, the Spanish Gypsy scale and the harmonic minor are foundations for classical chord resolution, which is a term I learned very recently. Flamenco melodies, Middle Eastern sounds and textures. Those scales are foundations for that entire world of music, and that can, you know, open your repertoire to perhaps some landscapes of sound that you have not explored before, and they're really fun. Another thing worth noting is I've shaded in the notes on this diagram based on the frequency with which they occur across all 16 of these scales and modes. And this is what I was referring to earlier when I said common notes. So by common notes, I mean these notes in the middle strip here, this middle band, 0, 5, -5, -2, and 2. Those are the notes that make up the pentatonic neutral scale, which is central to everything on this diagram. Those notes that make up the pentatonic neutral scale are over 60% of the notes in this diagram. So if you learn the pentatonic if you learn the intervals and become familiar with navigating the intervals of the pentatonic neutral scale, you also incidentally have memorized the notes that comprise the majority of the major, the pentatonic major, the Mixolydian, dominant pentatonic, Dorian, Aeolian. I got a list here. Let me pull it up. Harmonic minor, minor blues, Phrygian, and Spanish gypsy scales. So that's a lot of scales that you have the bulk or the foundation of memorized just by memorizing the pentatonic neutral scale. And it's because they share these interval classes in common with each other. That's powerful knowledge. And then if you add in +3 and -3 on top of that to master the Dorian mode, the Dorian mode is just the pentatonic neutral with the threes, +3 and -3. You add those two notes in and you've already learned 80% of what you can play across these scales. It's just a matter of familiarizing yourself with the intervals and recalling which ones apply and don't in these different modes and scales. So in other words, just a few spatial relationships or a few interval class relationships relative to the root are all that stand between you and a ton of freedom and expression on the fretboard. Just to show what the alternative would be if I weren't thinking of things isomorphically and numerically, then rather than learning a smaller structure that can be applied to any key, if you're wanting to play scale runs faster, you do need to memorize scales across all 6 strings and 12 frets in all 12 keys for all 16 different scales. And this is all of that information here on the left. That is what you would have to memorize. But instead, if you develop a system of thinking, which is what we're doing here, you can use this system of isomorphic tuning and interval awareness as a GPS or a compass, or if you want to think of it like a magnetic field that guides you wherever you are on the fretboard. As long as you're able to keep track of where you're at in your mind's eye and have an understanding of intervals relative to the key or the root note that you're in, that is how you can free yourself on the guitar rather than this tedious pattern of memorization. So instead of tedious memorization, focus instead on interval awareness, and that is where we're going to begin. And the best way to start is with the common notes that are at the center of all of these scales, and that is the pentatonic neutral scale, which you see on the left here, and the Dorian mode, which you see on the right. So pentatonic neutral scale is 0, 2, 5, -5, -2, 0. Dorian is exactly the same, except you add in +3 and -3. So to practice what we talked about today and to begin your journey on memorizing all the scales that you want, you need to start at the core of it, which, as we mentioned, is the pentatonic neutral scale. So here we have the Dorian scale pulled up. If we take the threes away, +3 and -3, that gives us the pentatonic neutral scale. Furthermore, if we strip that down to just 0, 5, and -5, so we get rid of +2 and -2, which I have set up as a custom scale here, we can look at truly the most important, most simple thing you need to become familiar with in terms of navigating intervals on the guitar. So to begin with, we've got B assigned as our root note, which is the 7th fret on the E string. So 0, go up to the next string, staying in the same fret to 5, up 2 from there to -5, and then up 1 string from there back to 0, which is your root, just in the next octave. So get familiar with that shape in the 3x3 structure, and then the exact same thing going from 0 to 5, except then up to -5 over here, which is 3 frets back and up 1 string, and then up to the next root note from there. That is your 4x4 structure. So become familiar with playing that exact same thing we just did in the 3x3 structure in the 4x4 structure. And not just familiar with playing that, but familiar with, okay, if I'm at -5, I know I can go to 0, and then I can go up to the next string, I'm at 5, and I can go up 2, and I'm at -5, and I know I got access to a root note above that. Being able to be really fast about being aware of where you're at relative to 0, 5, and -5. Then once you're familiar with that, or you're comfortable with that, and you feel like you can freely navigate around the fretboard doing that, then go ahead and go to your pentatonic neutral scale. So if you can see right here, you've got the pentatonic neutral scale pulled up. We added in the 2s, so +2 and -2 are added on top of +5 and -5. And within our 3x3 structure, we have 0, 2, 5, -5, -2, 0. The exact same thing in your 4x4 structures, just as, if not more important, it's probably more important. So starting at 0, you go up a string and back 3 frets to get to 2, up 3 from there to 5, up a string, back another 3 to get to -5, up 3 to -2, and then to 0. That is the exact same thing. Once you're comfortable doing the same thing with that and navigating around the fretboard, so if I'm on 0, I can go up to 0 at the next root note, and then I know I've got that above it, and you can just become intimately familiar with root note location identification and your awareness of the intervals around it, namely 5 and -5. So then you add your +2, -2 on top of that, you get familiar with that, and when you're ready and you feel familiar enough messing around in the pentatonic neutral scale that you're bored with it, go on to the Dorian mode, and that's going to add in this strip of notes that you see missing here, kind of this diagonal line that runs through here. That is your 3s, so +3, -3. That's what's missing to make up the Dorian mode. Now in the Dorian mode, it's the same thing, except you just add a 3 here and a 3 here. So rather than playing just, which is your pentatonic neutral, you add those 3s in to get your full Dorian scale, or Dorian mode, and that is. And the exact same thing in your 4x4 structure over here is. Now, keeping an awareness of your interval location, practice the Dorian mode in this 4x4 structure, and just, see how much different sounding stuff you can come up with while confining yourself to that prison of just 16 squares or boxes or notes. So this 4x4 box here, ranging from the root note here to the root note 3 frets back and 3 strings up, which in total, including both of those root notes, when you make a box around that, is 16 squares. Within that 4x4 structure, see how much variety you can try to squeeze out of it. Just get a feel for it, mess around with it, drill the hell out of it until you're bored with it, and that probably means going beyond even where I am at with it right now. Get super familiar with 0s and 5s and locating them extremely quickly across the fretboard. Add in your +2 and -2, and you have the pentatonic neutral scale. Become extremely familiar with that, and then advance on to the Dorian mode. And if you can master the Dorian mode and maintaining interval awareness while navigating freely across the fretboard with it, that is going to put you on the fast track to learning all of those other scales and modes very quickly. So that is the end of today's lesson. Again, my name is Eric Wright, creator of Guitar Gaze and author of a numerical and visuospatial method for learning guitar. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you at the next one. Cheers.